And once again, this is a CLE session, so if you want to sign up for that, there is a sign-up sheet in the front. And then be sure to get your certificate if you need that after. Those will be available after the session as well, if you're looking for continuing legal education credit. So welcome, everybody, to this session on citizenship and voting. This has been one of the hottest topics that we've been tracking this year. I'm Katie Owens-Hubler. I'm the director of the Elections and Redistricting team at NCSL. I'm just going to give a quick overview of a few of the things that we've been seeing on this topic and then turn to the panel. So let me introduce my panel. On the agenda previously, we did have Brian Caskey from Kansas. He was unfortunately not able to make it, but we're very lucky that we have Amy Cohen, who's the executive director of the National Association of State Election Directors, to provide a national perspective on this. Michelle Tassinari, who is the Director and Legal Counsel of the Elections Division and also Deputy Secretary of State for Massachusetts, and Representative Bob Lynn from New Hampshire. So I'll kick us off just talking a little bit about why we're discussing this topic today. Oops. Sorry about that. Somehow jumped to the end. Okay, there we go. So our team tracks legislation, election legislation from all over the country. We track about 3,000 bills every year. And this one in particular, the last several years, is one of the hottest topics. And by this topic, I mean citizenship and voting. So that's the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And if you're wondering kind of why we call it the hottest topic, it's because it was the largest topic that we tracked in our database this year. And that's somewhat new. We have seen a trend of this happening in recent years, but this was certainly the hottest topic for us this year. Just to kind of set the stage a little bit here. So when we talk about voter qualifications across the country, there are generally three things that are true. And of course, this varies a bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But usually to be a voter, you have to be a US citizen, you have to be 18 years old, and you have to reside in the jurisdiction. Now, there are some localities throughout the country that have slightly different qualifications. There are some places that allow non-citizens to vote. Those are typically small localities in some states. There are also some localities or school boards, for instance, that allow those who are under the age of 18 to vote. But generally, these are the three qualifications that we talk about when we talk voter qualifications. So the first one, of course, is the topic of discussion today. And we'll talk a little bit about how elections verify voter eligibility, both kind of when registration occurs at that point of someone applying to register to be a voter, and then also during voter list maintenance. But first, I'm just going to provide a bit of history and context. So again, I mentioned that we track about 3,000 election administration bills every year. Some years more than others. This was a pretty big year. So we tracked 191 introduced bills in 42 states that touch on the topic of citizenship and voting in one way or another. Now, we see this in a variety of ways. One is asking for a documentary proof of citizenship. So that's actually asking someone to provide a document that shows their citizenship at the point of registration. And we'll talk about that today. There are also bills that require comparisons with other databases in order to provide that check. So if the DMV database, for example, has that information, or if there's another database that can be verified in the state that can look at that. There are also quite a few states that have passed amendments to their state constitutions to require that only citizens are permitted to vote in the state. Most constitutions already made it clear that that is a qualification. I say this is kind of like an extra clarification, that only citizens can vote in the state. So we've seen a trend of those recently too. We've also seen some states make changes to their driver's license. That's actually the appearance of the driver's license, so something to denote whether someone is a citizen or a non-citizen on the driver's license itself. And then just a few other things we've seen is increasing penalties for those that may have inadvertently gotten on the rolls who are non-citizens and did cast a ballot, increasing penalties for those individuals, requiring periodic audits of voter rolls for non-citizens. This is a little bit different than the voter list maintenance that's done on a consistent basis. This is a look back and trying to identify specifically if there are non-citizens that inadvertently got on the rolls. And then also prohibiting non-citizens voting in local elections. As I mentioned, there are a handful of jurisdictions throughout the country that do permit that in local elections only. So we've seen some bills introduced to prohibit that. So again, one of the big things we'll talk about here is documentary proof of citizenship for registration. I always like to make the point that this isn't necessarily new. This is something that's been considered for quite a while. The first case we saw on this was in 2004 in Arizona. That was actually a ballot measure that required citizens to provide proof of citizenship upon registration. And then there was another sort of wave of these in 2009 and 2011. And then more recently in 2024, New Hampshire passed a bill, which we'll talk about. Louisiana did in 24 as well, and then Wyoming in 25. And then ballot measures amending state constitutions. Again, this isn't necessarily new. The first one we saw of these was in North Dakota in 2018, but you'll see there's been an uptick over the years. And we also have 4 states that have already approved that to be on the ballot in either 25 or 26. So we'll continue to see this trend, we anticipate as well. Okay, so that's my sort of beginning piece, and I'll turn to the panel for the rest of it, but do want to note here, I will keep this QR code up the entire time. So if you would like to ask a question, if you would please get that QR code, and you'll see the Slido app, you need to choose the room. So choose the citizenship and voting room, and you can ask a question using that app. So I'll keep that open, and after I've gone through some questions with the panel, we can take some from the audience as well. So with that, I'd like to turn to our panel. So I'll start first actually with Michelle, and then Amy in a moment to talk a little more widely. But can you talk us through how verification of eligibility works when someone is first registering?
Sure. There are different types of ways in which people can register to vote. The most common way people register to vote is through the Registry of Motor Vehicles at an agency. But originally, a lot of people will also vote by mail, register to vote by mail. There is federal law. The Help America Vote Act requires certain information be collected on a voter registration form, which includes the question, are you a U.S. citizen? It also requires the applicant to include their driver's license number. If they don't have a driver's license number, to include the last 4 of their social security number. If they have neither of those, they write the word none. So for a person who's registering to vote for the first time and they're registering by mail, either their driver's license number or social security, the last 4 of their social security number will be run through a check system required by the Help America Vote Act. It's confirming that they are a person. It is not confirming that they are a citizen. And if they don't have either of those and they write the word none, they will be required to show identification the first time they go to vote. In a federal election. So most people will register, and again, that only applies to first-time registrants by mail. So for everybody else that's registering through an agency or in person at a local election office, the form is similar. It has that information on it. And again, they're putting a date of birth on there. They're checking the box that they are a U.S. citizen. But other than that, there is not necessarily a verification unless you're going through, again, in Massachusetts, we have real IDs, so there is an automatic voter registration process, which does require when you're doing a transaction at the Registry of Motor Vehicles, in order for your information to be transmitted for voter registration purposes, you do have to have provided proof of documentation sufficient to show citizenship, I think is the legalese in which they use. And then we have an online voter registration system, and our online voter registration system hits against the Registry of Motor Vehicles database. So you have to both have a signature on file with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, as well as have gone through that verification process through the registry.
Great, thanks. And Amy, anything to add from a national perspective?
So most states do it pretty similarly. We say in elections, if you know elections in one state, you know elections in one state. So a lot of my answers are going to be like, well, it depends. But broadly, what Michelle described is consistent across the country. One thing I'll note is that, especially for those states that use online voter registration, most of them are bouncing off of motor vehicles to get a signature. But also when they're doing that, they're getting other information. So in some places they are getting that citizenship information through the DMV, or if someone has provided an alien ID number or something like that at the motor vehicle agency, then they're getting it there. But broadly speaking, the process that Michelle outlined is pretty consistent across the country. The specifics will vary a a little bit depending on where you are, but broadly, that's pretty much how it works.
Okay, thank you. Representative Lynn, so you passed a bill last session and then another one that was considered just more recently this year on requiring a document to prove citizenship. So could you talk through a little bit of what was the impetus behind that, some of the considerations for that?
Sure. So this bill passed in 2024, I believe, or maybe it was 2023. Anyway, it didn't become effective until after the 2024 election. So the only election that it has actually been in operation for is our local elections that happened in March of 2025, where things like school board members, local selectmen, that kind of thing, those kind of positions are voted for. And that was done really deliberately because there was a concern that if the bill, and that reminds me, it was 2024, late in the session in 2024 that we passed the bill. So June that the bill was passed, and there was a concern that if the bill became effective for the 2024 general election, that might not give local election officials enough time to kind of get ready for it. So that's why it was made effective after that. But anyway, basically what the bill says is that in order to vote, you have to satisfy 4 requirements and provide documentary proof of those 4 requirements. Depending on which requirement it is, what the proof can consist of may vary a bit. But the 4 things are: you have to provide proof of age, domiciliary, citizenship, and identity. And that changed the prior law, and I should say there are no exceptions to that. You either provide those 4 things or you don't vote. The other thing that I think is kind of important to understand here, to put this in perspective, is New Hampshire is one of, I believe, 8 states. I stand to be corrected on that, but I believe it's 8, that is not subject to the National Voter Registration Act. And that's because when that act was first enacted, I believe in the early 90s, states that allowed same-day registration, which New Hampshire did then and still does, were accepted from the coverage of that act. So somebody can come in and register to vote on the day of the election. And what the new bill that I was just talking about, 1569, does, it says, yes, you can still do that, but you need to bring the documentation to establish those 4 things in order to vote.
Okay, great, thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, it was in effect for just a smaller election earlier this year. So given that experience and some additional conversations that you've had, were there some things that you looked back at the 2024 bill and thought, oh, there was something that we didn't quite think through the implementation of, or something that we'd like to revisit? What did you look at in 2025?
I think if you, I guess whether there were significant problems or not sort of depends on, candidly, who you're asking. I think that from my perspective, I don't think that there really were very many problems. Were there a few people who didn't provide the appropriate documentation? Yeah, that's true, and they didn't vote. But I guess my take was it was relatively minor. And those people, who didn't provide the documentation, the law was in effect. They kind of knew what the requirements were, and they didn't meet them. Now, I think, candidly, people who have a different perspective on that would say, oh no, this was a significant problem that a number of people. I don't think it was a huge number, but there were, it was more than 2 or 3 that were not able to vote because they didn't meet the requirements.
Thank you. And how about in 2025 with the absentee voting provisions as well? Could you talk a bit about that?
You're talking about the new bill? Yes. So one of the things, and I guess maybe this really it goes to your earlier question too, one of the things that we did realize after the 2024 bill was passed is that it didn't specifically deal with requests for absentee ballots. And there was at least arguably, again, depending on what side of the issue you're on, there was at least arguably some conflict between the bill passed in 2024 and the absentee voting provisions as they previously existed. So there were some changes made to make them, to make them the same. So the same requirement applies if you're asking for an absentee ballot. You have to provide the same documentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. And as I mentioned a little bit, there is a history of this. So we do have a few states that passed this some years back. And we have also seen that typically there are lawsuits that come about as a result of the documentary proof of citizenship. We've seen that in New Hampshire, also Louisiana, Wyoming, the states that have passed it more recently. So Amy, could you give us a bit of a history of sort of past lawsuits, some of the court cases, and what we've seen on this previously?
Sure. So I think you mentioned in 2004, Arizona passed their Proposition 200, which required voters to provide proof of citizenship when they registered to vote or casted a ballot. And there were lawsuits pretty quickly. And so it wasn't in effect for the 2006 election. And there was a lot of back and forth in court that I'm not a lawyer, so I won't bore you with. But ultimately, in 2013, the Supreme Court held that the law violated the National Voter Registration Act, which, in addition to some of the provisions that Representative Lynn was talking about before, also creates the National Voter Registration Form, which is a nationwide form that requires that a person assert under penalty of perjury that they're a citizen, but it does not require that they're a citizen, and that's maintained by the Election Assistance Commission. But so the Supreme Court held that the law violated the NVRA, which does not require proof of citizenship. It said that the NVRA allows states to develop their own registration forms, but the federal form must suffice for federal elections, and that states must accept the federal form without additional information. And so the result is that Arizona has basically a bifurcated system. So people who use the federal National Voter Registration Form to register are not required to provide the documentary proof of citizenship, but then they're only permitted to vote in federal elections. And then the people who use the state form to register are required to provide documentary proof of citizenship, and upon doing so satisfactorily can vote in all contests. So basically the state has to maintain these sort of two lists of people. And then the other sort of big case was in Kansas. In 2011, they passed a law requiring documentary proof of citizenship with the federal form to go into effect for the 2014 cycle. And so everyone who was registered at the time was deemed to have provided proof of citizenship. So it only applied to new registrations, so everybody moving forward. And it allowed for an affidavit if the name on the application was different from the proof they were provided. So if you got married, divorced, changed your name, something like that. And ultimately what they found was that 30 to 40,000 people were not able to provide the required proof. In 2016, there was a temporary injunction, and in 2018, it went to trial and the state lost. So the law was permanently barred from being enforced, and the Supreme Court declined to review that. And so the result for Kansas at least, is that even if there is a federal law that is passed requiring documentary proof of citizenship, Kansas, per this court order, cannot comply given the substance of that order. And then the last one I'll sort of flag is a little bit different because Alabama, Georgia, and Kansas all asked the Election Assistance Commission, which maintains the federal form, to add documentary proof of citizenship to the instructions on the federal form. Kansas, because of the law that I just talked about, and Alabama and Georgia, which apparently had laws on the books about that. And that ultimately led to litigation, which I believe is still ongoing to this day, though I'm not quite sure the specifics of what is happening right now. But basically that the court held that the NVRA requires the EAC has to determine whether an instruction is necessary to enable the state to assess eligibility before adding that instruction to the form. And it held a couple of other things, but that's really the sort of relevant piece. So this has been going on for a long time, and I think Katie, you gave a really good overview of the amount that we've seen since 2024. The thing I'll note that I've heard from my members is that part of the increase at the state level has been driven by the increase at the federal level. So the discussion of the SAVE Act in Congress last year, even very early, I think it started in April-ish or May, that's when we started hearing from our members about this was bubbling up in their states. So that may sort of match what you've seen as well with the data, but we really sort of saw it drive from the federal level down.
Great, thanks. That's a great point. And I'll turn to Representative Lynn as well, since you have a legal background. I don't know if there's anything you want to add about some of the legal arguments you've heard about this.
Yeah, well, I think that there's no question that this is an issue that is, as was just said, it is, arising all around the country, and I think eventually the Supreme Court is going to have to address the issue. It may be that the law in New Hampshire, as an example, but there may be other, maybe percolating in other states, may provide a particularly good opportunity for that, in the sense that because we're not subject to the National Voter Registration Act, the preemption argument is pretty much is not in effect. So if the question, I think, could be presented fairly squarely to the Supreme Court, is this, as a constitutional question, is it constitutional to require people to provide documentary proof of citizenship or not? Because the form that is required under the National Voter Registration Act, it just doesn't apply in New Hampshire.
Michelle, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add as well from the legal angle.
I definitely agree that I think it will be subject to further litigation, and there are some attempts right now to make changes to the federal form to require that as part of the documentation, and there is already currently litigation that has enjoined the executive order that would make some of those changes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the executive order? And we mentioned the SAVE Act as well, just some of the things that are kind of percolating at the federal level, and tied to that too. So Amy mentioned a little bit in Arizona, a difference between federal elections and state elections because of the proof of citizenship requirement. And if there was something on the federal level, what are some of the implications if there'd be a similar bifurcated system in states?
Yeah, at least, I mean, I can speak for Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, in New England, and a couple other states, we do things for our elections, and New Hampshire does it this way by city or town. So we have 351 local election officials. Wisconsin beats us with over 1,800. So again, you're looking at local election officials. We have the city of Boston that has a significant population, and then towns in Western Mass that have less than 100 voters. So for our purposes, we maintain a statewide database. We've created it. We provide the local election officials with all of the tools and equipment that they need to enter their voters, but they are the ones processing the voter registrations. If there were a second set of voter registrations to be used for a federal election, it would create, I think, there would obviously be some technology challenges on our side to create a separate list that flags people that are just eligible for federal elections, and then those that are eligible for other municipal elections and state elections. I think part of the challenge that I also see is, both having different forms for different things, and then for purposes of just resources. So for state elections, our state elections correspond to our federal elections. So in November of even-numbered years, we have federal offices on the ballot as well as state offices. All of our state reps, state senators, governor's council, and then in some years, state constitutional offices. If there were different requirements, we would have to print different ballots. And for those state elections, our office is responsible for printing all of the ballots for the cities and towns. And that also includes whatever ballot questions there may be. So including statewide ballot questions, local ballot questions. If there were a bifurcated system and we had to print separate ballots for federal offices than for the state offices, my concern would be both getting enough paper to be able to do that. The tariffs have increased the price of paper, and just the availability of paper generally has been a challenge since COVID, essentially. So getting the paper to be able to print those ballots, the costs of printing those ballots, and then the administration of that. So if you're going to be sending a ballot to a voter that might qualify for both, great. If you're sending a ballot for voters that only qualify for one, making sure you're sending them what they are qualified for vote by mail. And then, when they're returning that, it's just going to increase postage costs. And just inside a polling location, we do have a significant population that does vote by mail in Massachusetts. And then there's the people that come for early voting and are voting on election day. And making sure that the poll workers who are in the polls on election day are providing people with the right ballots. And if it's close and someone has gotten the wrong ballot, how does that affect the results of the election? So those are things that, worry me and keep me up at night.
The thing I'll add, especially for legislators and legislative staff, so to be clear, NASA doesn't have a position on any of the stuff happening at the federal level, but one thing to think about with proof of citizenship is aging voter registration databases. And so a lot of these systems are very old. Michelle's is particularly old here in Massachusetts, but they can't necessarily store images. So you can add a field, for example, that might say, did this person provide proof of citizenship? Yes, no. But if you're then asking election officials to store whatever the voter provided, so an image of a driver's license, an image of a birth certificate, something like that, a lot of voter registration databases can't do that right now. And so it is sort of an additional complexity from our side of things, is not just like what do we have to do, but the how do we do it? Because if you're asking people to store images, if you're asking them to store that additional data, not every voter registration system that is in use in states right now is able to do that.
Great, thank you. That's an excellent point. And if there's one thing you could do, if you want to go back to your state and sort of ask your state election official, how old is our system? Do you need resources to update it? What does it look like? If you haven't seen it before, it's actually pretty helpful to get them to kind of show you what it looks like. I've seen a few where it looks like it's 1995. So it's something to go back to your states potentially. Sorry,
Hey,
Michelle, that might be yours.
That might be ours. We are in the middle of a new one. So I will add though, as you were saying, not just to store it, but even if your database has the capacity to store images, what do you have to do to be able to create that new functionality within the database? And I think that as an election official who has a lot of communication with other states, you're always trying to balance what functionality and improvements you're making to the database that is required versus what is wanted. And we really try to cater to our local election officials to make sure that what we're providing them is what's useful to them. And if I have to put something on the back burner that is actually really helping them in their job, so we can now shift our focus to a new technology project to be able to add this information, it takes a long time to be able to do those. It's not just a project that you can whip out in a couple of weeks. They're significant challenges to be able to develop the technology to make the changes.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to use that as a little bit of a segue to talk about Real ID as well, because a lot of the questions that we get, since we're all doing Real ID, it took us 20 years to get there, but states are all able to provide Real ID at this point, and part of that is a citizenship verification step. Now, Real ID does not necessarily mean it's proof of legal presence. It's not necessarily proof of citizenship. So can you speak a little bit about that and sort of what DMVs are collecting and how available that data is to state offices potentially? Amy, I might start with you if that's all right.
So it varies by state, what is available to the state election office. Some of them are getting that citizenship information, but they're not getting the what, they're just getting the yes, no kind of information. And I think it's really important to emphasize the point that a Real ID is a proof of lawful presence. It's not proof of citizenship. There are some driver's licenses called enhanced driver's licenses that are both proof of identity and proof of citizenship, and they're It's basically a partnership between the state motor vehicle agencies and the Department of Homeland Security. And those are in Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington. And basically those can be used for border crossings into Canada, into Mexico, and into the Caribbean. But that's a very small universe of states. Separate from those enhanced driver's licenses, though, there are states that indicate citizenship on their driver's license. So North Dakota is one. Katie, I think you mentioned that earlier. I believe Ohio is one as well. And that's sort of that's on top of the Real ID piece. And actually, I'll just brag on North Dakota a little bit because I think it's very clever that the state law is that when someone becomes a citizen, they're required to get a new driver's license, and the Secretary of State's office covers the cost of that because that is then identification that they can use for voting. So I think that's a nice sort of compromise in that process.
Michelle, anything to add on the Real ID?
Yeah, I mean, I had previously mentioned about how in Massachusetts we have automatic voter registration. And so automatic voter registration is through both our registry of motor vehicles as well as our health agencies. And so those are agencies that collect citizenship data in their normal course. So for our automatic voter registration process, when you're going to the registry of motor vehicles and applying for a driver's license, renewing a driver's license, it applies to a permit. If you have provided documentary proof of citizenship to them, that's the only time your name will come over for voter registration purposes. If you have provided them with other documentation for lawful presence but not the citizenship piece, it will not be transmitted to us. And so that's kind of a change from you used to be able to opt in where you would get at the registry of motor vehicle, you would get the question, do you want to register to vote? Are you a U.S. citizen? Those questions no longer exist as part of our process. It is based on the documentation that is provided. And the same applies to the health agencies. We have Mass Health and the Health Connector. They have they have an online application process where they are collecting information, whether it's an online application or an in-person application. They're also collecting citizenship data just because you have to. Some programs do require you to be a citizen to be able to receive those benefits. And so the people that are applying that have that documentation as well come over to us without being asked the question of, do you want to register to vote?
Thanks. Representative Lynn, anything from New Hampshire on Real ID, if you're familiar with any numbers or sort of that issue in New Hampshire?
New Hampshire within the last year, I believe, adopted Real ID as a requirement, that you have to have that. And as I understand it, the way it works with our motor vehicle department is that if you provide, you don't have to be a citizen to get a driver's license under the Real ID, but if you are a citizen, the motor vehicle department will have that information, and I believe that information is available to be shared with the Secretary of State's office. So that, that can, in many cases, be the way that someone's citizenship is verified.
It's verified. Okay, great. Thank you. And that's a good segue into sort of the voter list maintenance piece of this too. So there is a process in states where that list is checked against various databases, and you're looking to verify eligibility of voters that are already on the rolls and kind of continually cleaning that list and making sure that it's accurate. So if you could speak to, Michelle, I might start with you, kind of how that works and what checks are being conducted.
So through our voter list maintenance, we do not verify or run things against a database to check for citizenship. Again, a person is, when they're registering, affirming they're a citizen, and if they're registering through our registry of motor vehicles, at this point, the citizenship has been vetted through them. So it's not part of our list maintenance process. I think you're probably talking about, a lot of people are now starting to use the systematic alien verification
Of entitlements.
of entitlement. It's called SAVE. So they're using a SAVE database, which is through the Citizen and Immigration Services. Which you can upload a full Social Security number, and it will verify someone's citizenship. Is that accurate, Amy? Because you look like you're going to interrupt me. Go ahead.
Well, no, do you want to finish? Then I'll correct you.
Then she'll correct me. We don't collect a full Social Security number, so it's not something that we would have the capacity to use if we were so inclined. But I'm sure Amy has more about how that works in other states.
So until earlier this year, there were a variety of things about SAVE that made it really challenging for election offices to use. One was the cost. It was like $1.50 or $2, I think, a record. And, you know, that adds up pretty quickly. So that was one of them. The other was there was no bulk upload functionality. So anytime you wanted to query on an individual person, you had to do it manually one by one by one by one by one by one, which is maybe only practical in a state like Rhode Island, but is not going to be practical in a place like California. And then the other challenge for us was that election officials typically do not have alien ID numbers. And the SAVE system until earlier this year required either alien ID or another DHS enumerator. So any sort of immigration number. And so starting April 1st, they eliminated the cost for election offices, I believe for everyone, but definitely for election offices. And so that took that out of it. Then they have added a bulk upload functionality, which means that you can upload, you know, thousands of records at a time, and it will sort of query on each one individually. About 2 months ago, they integrated with the Social Security Administration. And so Michelle is right that you right now can only search on full 9 of social. And there's only, I think, 6 states that for voter registration purposes are collecting full 9 of social. Everyone else is collecting either last 4 or in at least one weird case, last 5. But so right now they can only use either a DHS enumerator or full 9 of social. They are still working on the last 4. And the results that you get back are, you know, if they have a match with Social Security, then that is, and Social Security can tell them whether that person is a citizen or not. So they're getting sort of that this person is a citizen. If they're unable to make a match either on social, they're getting, you know, you need to investigate this further. And then if they're getting a match on the DHS enumerator, which is typically alien ID, then they're getting sort of a conclusive answer one way or the other. The thing that I want to emphasize is that it's still, election offices still have to do a level of validation to make sure that the people that are coming back as either DHS can't or SAVE can't match them, or that they're not citizens. Election offices are still doing additional validation with other data points within their states to make sure that that information is accurate and up to date, because both SAVE and voter registration lists are both moments in time. And so there is an additional level of validation required from election offices. And I know that maybe doesn't sound like a lot of work, but if you're getting, say, you know, 10,000 people back that you have to investigate, that's a lot of human hours to do that additional level of investigation on each of those people. So I just like to emphasize that it's not sort of a push button solution. And the last 4 is going to change a lot for election offices. It's going to certainly open the universe of states that are able to leverage this, but last 4 is not unique either. And so there is still going to be a level of validation that is required, because, you know, you're getting first name, middle name, last name, date of birth, and last 4. That's not those are not necessarily unique. And so it's still going to require a level of investigation. And so it is just an important thing to remember that none of this is sort of a push button solution for election offices, and they are going to still have to do additional validation work.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a point for any part of it. So Michelle, if you could talk a little bit more about list maintenance in general. So you're also checking addresses, you're checking for voters who have passed away, sort of how does that work? And then what actions are you taking? You're not just removing somebody necessarily. So if you could.
Yeah, I can certainly talk about that. I will say in Massachusetts, we are definitely unique in the way we do list maintenance. I believe we are the only state in the country that does an annual street listing, which would be a municipal census every single year. So our local election officials will send out a census form to every household every single year, on which if they don't receive a response, or if the response says someone in the household has moved and they are a voter, they would be made inactive and sent a confirmation notice. Sometimes they'll send a second mailing to catch up on that. But otherwise, in the regular list maintenance process, we actually, again, because we have local election officials, many of them are also the registrars of vital records for their cities and towns. And so if there is a death record that comes through, they're able to remove a voter. We also partner with our Department of Public Health in the state, and we get lists, I think it's every 3 months. Before elections, we do it more frequently, so we'll get lists of people who have passed away, which includes people who have passed away outside of Massachusetts, so we can send those to our local election officials to make sure that, we'll run it against the database and say, hey, we think this person has passed away, but it's up to our local election officials to make sure that they are, again, it's the additional level of verification to make sure that it is the correct person. And then just through the normal course, as people move, they could be made inactive if they didn't respond to their street list or another mailing that we send out. They could be made inactive and then sent a confirmation notice. The confirmation notices are required by federal law to be sent by forwardable mail with a postage paid return card, at which the voter can indicate, yes, I still live here. They could put a change of address within the city or town, or they could indicate that they no longer live there. If they return it, then they'll be, and say they still live there, or an address in the city or town, they're updated to their new address. If they indicate they no longer live there, then they would be deleted and sent a deletion notice. If they don't respond at all, they would remain on that inactive voter list for 2 federal elections. And again, this is a requirement in both state and federal law. So they would remain on that inactive voters list for 2 federal elections unless they do some sort of other action to make them active, which could be filling out a new voter registration form, signing an initiative petition or a candidate nomination paper, applying for an absentee ballot or a vote by mail ballot. Those are types of things that would activate the voter and which would restore them to the status. If you are an inactive voter and you go to vote, there is a piece of paper that you have to sign, an affirmation that you are who you say you are and you still live at the address. And then you do have to show identification to verify that you are still qualified to vote there.
Okay, thank you. Representative Lynn, anything to add on the voter list maintenance topic?
Not really. I just would follow up though on an earlier point that was discussed. The idea of having that one of the ways, for example, that citizenship, but really probably other things too, but citizenship, since that's what we're specifically focusing on, that the documentary proof of citizenship may be able to be something that is verified by the election official. In fact, we had a specific bill that was introduced this year. It ended up being what we call retained, which means it's going to be, it hasn't been killed, it's going to be considered again next year, that would have required the Secretary of State, if someone said, I am a citizen, I just was able, I don't have a passport and I wasn't, for example, able to get my birth certificate. This bill would have done 2 things. First, it would have required the Secretary of State, in cooperation with the local election official, to access whatever databases are available. And as I understand it from our Secretary of State, and I think as you sort of confirmed, the availability of those records to local election officials and secretaries of state is becoming more and more expansive, they're being able to get access to more and more of that. So this would have required the Secretary of State and the local election official to do that verification process and try to verify that the person in fact is a citizen. And then the other part of it was, we have heard some complaints that, well, if someone needs to get a birth certificate, that's costly. Some, particularly some people that are indigent might not be able to afford that. So there was a provision in this bill that would have basically provided that the state would provide a voucher. If you said, I'm from New Hampshire, I live in New Hampshire now, I want to vote, but I was born in Arkansas and it costs whatever to get my birth certificate from Arkansas, I can't afford that. The state would have provided a voucher to allow that to happen, to allow you to get it.
Oh, thank you, appreciate that. And that actually asked a question, or answered a question that we got asked on Slido as well. So I've been looking at those. So if you do want to ask some questions, I've been getting some coming through, but those QR code is available for that. So I think, Amy, I'll start with this one. So there's the sort of typical voter list maintenance processes that work, but there's also some states that have looked very specifically to try to identify potential non-citizens on the rolls, like sort of a point in time look to try to identify those individuals. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of how that's done? Like, what are you checking against, I guess, and what some of the results are?
So the ones that have been done in the past have relied on the SAVE system. And I should also be clear, SAVE is not a database. It's like the user interface to access a whole bunch of different DHS and DOJ databases. But so those sort of particular audits have been done on a much smaller community, right? Because they're people who registered to vote and for whom you have an alien ID number. And so that is a smaller universe of people. And so they did that in Georgia a couple of years ago, and they found a small handful. I don't remember the numbers offhand, but that was done in Georgia. And then they sort of built that SAVE step into their voter registration process. So anytime essentially they got someone for whom they were able to acquire an alien ID number, they were also sort of bouncing that against SAVE. Different states have done sort of different things like that in the past. Again, those have been limited by the constraints of the SAVE system. As SAVE is expanding the amount of data that they have on Americans through their integration with the Social Security Administration, states are sort of experimenting more, and we're still sort of waiting to hear out of those efforts what the numbers look like, because again, it requires like a lot of validation and verification to make sure that everyone is actually a non-citizen that is being flagged as one.
Great, thank you. Let me ask the audience real quick before I get to my next question. Can you raise your hand if you're a legislator? A lot. Yeah, great. How about if you're legislative staff? Oh, a lot there too. Excellent. Okay, so my question is sort of for all of you, what advice do you have? So if you're a legislator, legislative staff, someone considering some sort of legislation on this topic, and Representative Lynn, I'll start with you if that's all right.
Sure. Well, I think, I think to me, it is, obviously I was the prime sponsor of this bill. I think it is important. I think it's, it's not a constitutional provision in New Hampshire, but it is a statutory provision in New Hampshire that you have to be a United States citizen in order to vote. I think that's important. And so I think, I would encourage you to consider enacting legislation that requires people to be citizens to vote and requires something more. I have to say, I understand that what the National Voter Registration Act says, and I understand the 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decision that says the way it should be interpreted. I have to say, personally, it doesn't, I'm not satisfied that just having somebody swear I'm a citizen of the United States should be enough to meet the requirements that you're allowed to vote. Because if you follow that through, if that's true, then why doesn't that apply to the other, the other things too? I swear that I'm, if somebody comes in that looks pretty young, I swear I'm 18. I don't have to do anything else than do that. I swear I'm 18. I'll sign an affidavit. I should be able to vote. I swear I live at, in the district that I'm voting in. That should be enough to vote. I think we generally say that's not. And I don't think it really should be any different with citizenship. So I would encourage you to consider doing something along the lines of what New Hampshire did, of saying you provide documentation to meet the requirements of all the things that you need in order to vote, or you don't vote.
Thanks, Michelle.
Sure. From my perspective, I think, and I probably beating the drum here again, is making sure that you're having the conversations with the local election officials about how any implementation would affect them and affect their offices. They vary greatly as to the resources that are available to them, as well as the staffing. And so, if there is going to be some sort of implementation of any of the documentary proofs requirements, for any of the requirements for eligibility, it's having those conversations about what is our capacity, how are we verifying them, how do I determine the genuineness of these documents, having those conversations with the election officials and the people on the front lines who are going to be doing the work, to make sure that they have the resources available to them. So anything that does get implemented, you need to make sure that there's enough people, there's enough time, and that they have the funding available to be able to implement something in a way that is meaningful, as opposed to throwing a requirement at them that they won't be able to do. And you don't want to set someone up for failure if there's a common goal in something. You just want to make sure that they have those resources available to them.
Yep. Thank you. And Amy?
The only thing I would add is talk to local election officials from your big jurisdictions and from your small jurisdictions, because what works in LA County is not necessarily going to work in California's smaller counties, or what works in Dallas County isn't necessarily going to work in Loving County, Texas. And so talk to both of them, because the thing that we're very attuned to in elections, and that I think Michelle referenced before, is that local election officials in particular are not just election officials. They're tax collectors, they issue marriage licenses, they do stuff with death and taxes and dog licenses and all kinds of different things. And Michelle mentioned Wisconsin. They have over 1,900 local election jurisdictions, and most of them are part-time and turn over every year by design. And so recognize that when you're having these conversations, it's about how the largest jurisdictions will implement, but also how the smallest will. And when they tell you that they're spread really, really thin, believe them. So I guess I would also say, listen, even when you don't like what they're saying, listen, because they're not trying necessarily to be obstructionist, but they're really trying to figure out how they're going to get all of their state, local, and federal obligations met, because for elections, it really is federal, state, and local.
Great, thank you. It's a wonderful point. So a couple of questions from the audience then. So this one is for Representative Lynn, and I'm going to combine a couple of different ones, but it was a question about what documents are asked to prove citizenship, and also a little bit more, if you would, on how a voter is when they're requesting an absentee ballot. Do they need to provide documentary proof of citizenship only when registering to vote, or both when registering and requesting an absentee ballot?
Can you give me the first part of the question again?
The first one was about the actual documents required to prove
sure. So the New Hampshire statute says you have to provide any. It gives examples. It says, for example, birth certificate, passport, if you're a naturalized citizen, naturalization documents, or any other reasonable documentation of citizenship. That's the way the New Hampshire statute is worded. And so, for example, I think you might take from that what is required, for example, to get a passport, the proof of citizenship that you need to get a passport. And as I understand it, just to give an example, if you don't have a birth certificate, there are other things that you can provide, for example, church records or baptismal records or other things, even as I understand it in some cases, statements from other people who can attest to knowing you at a very young age. For example, those are just some examples. So I would think that those kind of things would constitute reasonable documentation. I should also note that, and this is probably unique to New Hampshire because we're really such a small state, there's a provision in the law that allows the election official, if the election official can, verify who, not only as to citizenship, which might make it a little bit hard. That might be a point that was a little bit harder, but conceivably even as to that, but as to any of the things that you need to show, if the person can, if the election official can say, well, of course that's Bob Lynn, he lives right next to me. That's good enough to satisfy that requirement. For a larger state, California, obviously, probably going to be a lot more difficult to have something like that.
Okay, thank you. And then the kind of second part was, is it required both at the point of registering and then also when someone is applying for an absentee ballot? Could you just clarify that
It's
one?
required at the point of registering. The absentee ballot the absentee ballot, I had introduced an absentee ballot bill this last year, and the absentee ballot bill that I had introduced would have provided that you only had to do that once. In other words, if you were asking for if you were registering to vote absentee, you had to do that only once. You didn't have to do that to actually vote. The bill was changed, and frankly, I don't, as I sit here now, I don't remember whether it was changed in that respect. I suspect not, but I'm not positive on that.
Okay, thanks. We can check on that too. So there's another question. It's sort of related to what we were discussing with the federal data and the SAVE database, but it's why has it been so difficult to use federal data to confirm a person's citizenship status in the U.S. when it seems to be easier to do this in other countries?
Part of that is because we don't have a national database the way that they do in other countries. So that is in other countries, there is like one national electoral authority. For example, there's like one list of registered voters, or there's one national ID card. We don't have that. We have federalism instead. And so it just makes it a little bit trickier. We are getting access to more data, but election officials are still sort of navigating what that looks like. And unfortunately, it's also become sort of a political potato as well. And that makes it hard. That makes it hard for people in some cases as well.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to? No? Okay. And another one, and honestly, this is going to be tough to answer, I think. So does documentary proof of citizenship have potential adverse effects on voter turnout? And what steps have states with that proof of citizenship taken to ensure voters have the proper documents? I think you spoke to this a little bit, Representative Lynn, but would anybody like to take that?
Yeah, I don't, again, this is, I'm sure it can be subject to debate. To me, it doesn't seem like it is onerous to say that you should have to provide a documentary proof in some reasonable documentation of your citizenship, just like, beyond just basically swearing I'm a citizen. And I don't think I don't think realistically that is likely to suppress the vote or reduce the number of people that have voted. Again, as I say, I use the example of the 2025 election, local elections. Now that I have to candidly say, I don't think that's local elections, that voter turnout is significantly less than in statewide elections, for state and federal officers. But nonetheless, in the 2025 election, it didn't seem like there was a huge problem of people not being able to vote. There were some, and it was, as I said before, it was more than 2 or 3, but it wasn't some huge problem. And I suspect that that's what we would find at a state election also.
I'll just remind the question asker that, Arizona has been doing their sort of bifurcated system for over a decade. So we can sort of look there and see what those numbers look like. But there are a whole bunch of different things that drive turnout and make people want to turn out. And I don't have to really emphasize that point too much in a room with a lot of elected officials. But, you know, that is also a part of it as well. It's not just what people need to provide, but do they actually want to be there in the first place?
I think turnout is incredibly difficult. I'm looking at our resident political scientist in the middle of the room here from MIT. But we always kind of joke that like it's the weather and there's all these factors that affect it. It's one of those tough things to look at. But also, Charles, maybe you want to take a look at this one sometime soon. We'll get more of an answer for that sometime. Okay, I'm going to offer everyone just one last word. We've just got a minute left. Is there anything you'd like to say that we didn't get to touch on?
No, I just want to thank you for asking me to participate in this. I think this is an important issue. It's not going away, and until it gets decided by the Supreme Court, I'm sure various states will have different views on how they proceed with this. But it's an important issue, I think, and a very interesting issue. And thank you for asking me to participate.
Yeah, I echo the thanks. I do agree that it's definitely a hot topic, and it's one that's being discussed, you know, I think at a legislative level as well as an election administration level. And I think that the conversations are definitely different. One's a logistical conversation, and one's there's legal conversations as well. So I do think that making sure that everybody is part of those conversations that ultimately will have a role in this is something that's important.
I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't emphasize that every election official that I work for, so all 50 states, DC, and the 5 US territories, every single one of them, regardless of party, regardless of anything in their background, cares so deeply that only eligible voters are able to participate in this process. So you may not agree with your state election office on everything, but please recognize that your election officials at the state level, and I don't work for counties, but I can, pretty confidently say at the county level, they only want the people who are supposed to be participating to participate. They care deeply about doing these jobs and doing these jobs well, and they take these responsibilities so very seriously. And again, you may not agree with their approach, but please recognize how much they care about doing a good job and getting it right. And also, thank you, Katie, for having me.
And that was a great way to end. Thank you so much to the panel, and thanks everybody for coming.